But equally in the 18th and 19th century, we find new literary and philosophical societies that exist to have learned discussions and found libraries as part and parcel of their operations. And then beyond that, we find early public libraries for working men, for the public as a whole. There are educational collections associated with employment collectives, with mechanical institutes. And beyond that, there are penny subscription libraries, circulating libraries. Individuals set them up in order to provide books for the widest possible selection of society. The first one I'm aware of was founded in 1728 by a certain Allan Ramsay. And he simply did it to make literature available to anyone. It was instantly criticised. It was obviously a bad thing. The Reverend Robert Woodrow, well, he wrote a tract against it. These days he'd have doubtless written to the Daily Mail. All the villainous, profane and obscene books printed in London can now be lent out for a low price to the youths, servants and even gentlewomen. Vice and obscenity is thus propagated. So, you know, if you make things accessible, obviously moral corruption is going to follow. And this was to be a trope over the next centuries. If you make books available to wider cross-sections of society, you're obviously going to pander to their self-evident weakness and vices. I mean, if things aren't written in Latin, who on earth is going to get, you know, you could corrupt anyone. When we move into the middle of the 19th century, we finally meet the beginnings of the public libraries that we wouldn't recognise today. The Public Libraries Act of 1850, pioneered by William Ewart, set up or created the framework for the libraries that still exist in towns today. It'll come as no surprise, perhaps, that it was bitterly opposed in Parliament by the Conservatives of the day. It was going to be funded from the rates, and they argued it was not fair that ratepayers, who of course were property owners and thus upper and middle class people, should be paying rates to subsidise libraries to which the lower class would have an access. And as a result of this, the bill was watered down. Municipalities with more than 10,000 inhabitants could establish libraries if a majority of the ratepayers supported the movement. So there's a series of sort of hurdles there. But there was one more. The Public Library Act meant you could build a library building, but you could not spend a penny on putting anything in it. So you created empty buildings. Bizarre but true. One could say that, you know, government thinking never quite changes, does it? Anyway, after 4 years of people complaining about this, in 1855, an act reversed it, and you could now spend a bit of rates money on actually putting something on the shelves of these wonderfully empty buildings that you had putatively built. And it was to be run by a committee whose main concern was not to develop a collection, but to minimise the expenditure on it. So you haven't really moved terribly far. The situation then is that these are closed collections. It's not the libraries we're used to where you can browse along the shelf. As a matter of course, you couldn't browse books in them. What you could do is you could consult a catalogue, and you would go into a counter and there would be a series of catalogues on it, and a few of the books in the library wouldn't be in that catalogue because they were too sensitive. So they'd have them, but you wouldn't even know they were there to get at them. So fascinating. Catalogue access, then you can have some choice if the book was available. This system was greatly enlarged by Andrew Carnegie, and I'm sure we've all come across him, the inhabitant, born in Dunfermline in Scotland, died in 1919, a great sponsor of libraries as a whole across the world, and he funded the construction of 660 extra free libraries in Britain. How were they doing? Well, in 1927, a parliamentary report on the public libraries of Great Britain concluded they were underfunded, full of random donations, lacked a collections policy, and had poorly qualified staff. So, with that ringing endorsement, the government then decided to do nothing whatsoever about it. They then discussed ad nauseam the balance between the educational function of libraries. You know, if you're paying rates for something, you don't just want a mere novel, do you? You want serious education. What could people have? What should they have? In theory, these libraries should be improving rather than entertaining. And there's a revealing submission to Parliament from the County Librarian of Fife in 1930. And one could feel, you know, if he didn't live in Fife, he would be outraged of Tunbridge Wells. He submitted in some high outrage that 80% of all the borrowings in his county were not the worthwhile reference works. They were sensational, sentimental, or sordid. That's what people wanted to read. The last phase I want to come on to very briefly is my lifetime. Is that history? I guess so. Well, in 1964, an Act of Parliament confirmed, validated, that libraries, public libraries, had a recreational function. That no longer was there this distinction between they were supposed to be educational and improving, and there was this uncomfortable ability to provide novels and so on. Now, fiction was allowed, though I must say that I still remember a system in libraries when I was a youth which encouraged you to take non-fiction rather than fiction. I won't go into that, but you know, we can in due course. So we've reached a watershed, and indeed in the 1970s, many public libraries were taken into the leisure departments of local authorities as opposed to the education departments. And that was on the back of being reclassified as having a leisure function as opposed to an educational function. So far, so good. However, at the same time, of course, there's been a big expansion in the university sector, the 1950s and 1960s, which had been building up their own research libraries. And rather regrettably, as a parallel to that, as public libraries went more into the leisure side, they sold off large quantities of their academic and reference collections. Not all of them, but many of them did, removing the possibility of scholarship for some people in certain areas. Well, let me sum up. Then after the 1980s, we're moving into modern history, and that's obviously to be passed on to one of my colleagues here. To sum up, library provision has never been ideal, and we should not kid ourselves that it has. I'm not certain there's ever been a golden age of libraries. If one probes all of these phases that I've outlined for you, had enormous strengths and enormous weaknesses. What has certainly changed, though, in my lifetime, and over the whole of the period that I've summarised as well, is the books are now more readily available today and cheaper than ever before. Books were extremely expensive on the whole in the Middle Ages. They became a little bit more economical after printing, but it took a long time for that to be the case, and they were still not cheap. Even novels in the early 19th century were not cheap. Walter Scott's three-decker novels, Substantial Things, as a matter of course, cost 1 to 2 guineas for a set. Now this was a massive amount of money. It would be a third to a half of the monthly disposable income of a lower middle class family. So you weren't going to go and buy that. And this is why little subscription societies that turned into subscription libraries had such a run at that time. Yesterday evening, I looked along my bookshelf and found a book from 1960 on Giotto, and took it off the shelf, and the printed price on it was 6 guineas. 6 guineas. In 1960, my father earned £5 a week. So an amazing, it was a big and expensive book, but he couldn't have bought that book with his weekly wage. What books today couldn't you buy with a weekly wage? And now, after the rise of paperbacks, Anne Lane, a paperback is the cost of a couple of cups of coffee, or even less depending on which bijou place you go to. A hardback is the cost of a couple of bottles of wine, and as we will hear, electronic means enable books and print to be delivered in ever cheaper ways. Well, whereas the monastic libraries with which we started were founded on principles of unchanging values, all I think we can be certain of today is that change is the way of life, and it's accelerating.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. Crystal